Thank you. Hi, everyone. So we already had the talk about AI, so now it's the talk about automation. I think it's becoming a ritual. So what we're going to talk about is an initiative that's part of the Network Automation Forum that we call the NAF Framework. So very quickly about me, Damien Garros, I'm the co-founder and the CEO of OpsMill. We're the company behind InfraHub. It's a next generation source of truth, or intent, as we call it in this. And yeah, I've come from a networking background. I've been doing automation now for too many years. And the same pattern, unfortunately, like I think Ivan did a podcast recently saying, nothing has really changed in the last 10 years. I think a lot of things have changed, but I think one thing that changed is, I think now it's acknowledged that you need automation. Like you cannot run a proper networks, you cannot run a multi-domain VPN network if you don't have automation. Now, and what we're saying is everyone today is really trying and looking at how they can actually automate, or nowadays call it apply AI, which is very similar in many ways. Now, the reality of the market is, it's still very much a mess, and it's still extremely difficult. And what we're saying is everybody's trying, a lot of failing, there's a lot of frustrations, and everybody's kind of, really trying to rebuild everything the hard way. And for a lot of you out there, imagine it feels like it's an impossible task. What we're seeing, the patterns that we're seeing is, a lot of us are still rebuilding from scratch. We're kind of always making the same mistakes that probably each of you are making, and learning all of those lessons the hard way. And at the end of the day, what's happening is we don't really have, we're all talking about low-level details, and I need to use netconf, I need to use Python, but we don't really have a blueprint on what is it looks like, the big pictures of what I need to build. So as part of the NAF community, I think it was almost 18 months ago now, many of us came together as okay, what can we do about it? How do we help the community? How do we try to define something and make sure everybody can get started faster? And to be honest, it was actually pretty hard. As soon as we started talking of my Python is better than your Ansible, and my Netbox is better than your InfraHub, that was actually really a big mess. We were arguing and couldn't even, amongst people that have the most experience, really agree on anything. What really worked is when we started abstracting from the tools, and instead talking about tools, and we actually started thinking about functional building blocks. It was not about, do you use Netbox, but how do you manage your intent? How do you manage, your orchestrations? How do you manage that? What do you need? And when you started talking about the functional building blocks, that suddenly we are speaking the same language. And that's really the foundation of, the NAF framework. And so it's not a very rigid architecture that you have to follow by the rule. The goal is not a complete reference architecture. The goal is really to help, kind of create a vocabulary and show a path and a lot of additional explanation of why you would need to build that, and try to really help people get started in this journey. So the way it looks is actually in a very simple way. We started simple, and then we're going to go a lot deeper. But we have those 6 functional building blocks from the presentation, observability, orchestration, intent, collector, and executor. We'll walk through some of them quickly today. But with that, you pretty much have the foundation of what you need, or at least the main functional building blocks that you need if you want to build an automation framework. Irrespectively of which tool you're using, you could have NetFabric in there, you could have every single tools we talked about today, we could map them into this framework. So the foundation of it, really this idea of, we talk first about functional building blocks. We don't focus on tools, otherwise we just argue endlessly. And it's impossible because it's like comparing apple and oranges. There's never going to be the exact same features between two tools. So let's not do that. It's not a fixed system right now. We're actually very much working on it, trying improving it. We started very high level to make sure we have the broader reach, and then we're going to go deeper into each of those building blocks and really go and discuss what are the capabilities, what are the requirements that you need, all of that. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And as I said, the goal is really to have something that will be helpful for beginners as well as experts. So it's both a map and also in some way, think of it as like the blueprint that we were missing. So if we wanted to, I like to say that when we build an automation framework, it's like building a car, except that no one is selling you a car in our industry today, so you're going to have to build your car. And if you want to take on that effort, you better have a blueprint because otherwise, and I think last year I was here actually explaining I built myself so many cars that didn't have doors, that were barely running, because I didn't have that blueprint, and I made all of those mistakes the hard way. So in terms of audience, it's not just about the people that are building the automation, even though if you're network automation engineers, network developers, it's probably going to be super helpful to have all of that and discuss. But what we truly believe is that for the users of automation, the network engineers, the architects, it's also very important to understand what are those functions that you can expect from those tools, because you're actually the users of those tools, and you need this language to discuss with the team that is actually providing those tools to them. You need this language to be able to turn there and say, to me, it's actually very important to have, for example, more control on how I can make changes. Where is my, and that's what this framework will also provide to you. So we're really trying to have both. So now, it's not like, we love our tools, all of them. We love argue about them. So where are they? I'm sure some of you are like, okay, it's okay, let's talk about the tools. But at the end of the day, we're going to need them. We're going to need to implement them. So how does that work? There is all those functional building blocks, and here I'm going to use 3 as an example: the presentation layer, observability, and collector. It's just as an example, but why it's important to differentiate them, it's because if we look in this space, we can see that some tools, for example, GNMIC, which is a really good collector, it only does one function, and it does it really, really well. It does the collector. Now there's Prometheus, which is a really good time series database to collect telemetry data, and it does the observability part. We have Grafana that does, for example, the presentation layer. So we see here it's easy. One tool, one building blocks. Now there's some tools like SuzyQ or Kentik. They actually do all 3 of them at the same time. And if you actually think about it, they're even complementary. Like, for example, Prometheus is doing the metrics, where SuzyQ is usually doing more like the structured states. And in a lot of cases, you're going to have both in your network. You might actually, for that matter, have all of them in your network, because they do provide different functions inside the observability, the collector of the presentation. And that's okay. If we look into it and if we go in the details, there's not a single tool behind every single building blocks. You can have many of them, and each tool can map to multiple of those building blocks. So there's kind of this matrix to keep in mind. But nonetheless, talking about each of those functional building blocks individually and why you need them and what you should expect from them, what are the features, completely changes the discussion. So the question we usually get when someone wants to start is, do I need to do all of it at first? Do I need all those 6 blocks and all of this complexity? The answer is a very clear no. It really depends on your use case, and some use case will only leverage, a part of those tools, a part of those blocks. You don't need the full pictures to get started. It's just like some use case will leverage all of them, some not. And there's not also a specific order. There's not, something that say you need to start with the intent or you need to start with all of that. It really, really depends on what you're trying to build. Just quickly to acknowledge the team behind it. I'm here just as a representative of the team, but there's many people, including Dinesh, Ryan, Christian, Srivida, Claudia, Wim, and all the NAF community actually involved behind that. So there's many people. If you're, by the way, at AutoCon in Munich in June, it's going to be a longer sessions on this specific topic on Thursday morning. So now let's look at a practical example. Usually we heard the feedback that it's still very abstract and show us the meat or in some way. So if we take an example, let's say that I want to have one use case. I want to be able to deploy a specific subnet, and I have 50 different sites, 50 POPs, let's say, and I want to deploy this subnet on all of them. In my environments today, I have all the tools in the background. I have Ansible, I have GNMIC, Prometheus, SUSE-Q, InfraHub, Kentix, that's the tool that I have. If we look at my specific map on how things map, we can see that many of them have this presentation layer. Ansible AAP is doing the orchestration in this environment. I have GNMIC or Ansible as my orchestrator. That's my setup. And now, the way we map this specific workflow, here, for example, we have the different steps. So what we're saying is usually, I need to build the slide that represents that better, but it's kind of a loop that starts from the intent. And we see that we usually start the intent to represent the state of the network. That's the expected state. So if you want to push a change, you need to change the expected state. And then once you have updated your intent, it flows into the executor that's going to push this change to the network. And then, and how does it happen? Usually it's the orchestration. The orchestration in the middle is the one that actually kind of move your workflow along the different blocks. So once the intent, the change in the intent happen, notifies the orchestrator that's going to say, okay, now I need to deploy. It relies on the executor, which is Ansible in this case, to make the deployment. Then once the change in your network, usually the collectors will pick that up automatically and then resurface the new state of the network in the observability block. And then the orchestrator will be able to find and see that the change he has pushed on one side has been coming back on the other side, and he will be able to do the validation. And he'll be able to say, okay, was that what I expected initially actually happened, yes or no? If something went wrong, then orchestrators can decide to make some corrective actions or not. But that's how we have this concept of a loop. And then usually you resurface that to the presentation layer, which is usually how a human will consume that. So hopefully that helps you understand better this framework. So now let's look, block by block, a little bit deeper on what do we have on we mean by each of them and what are those specific functions. And what defines first a specific functional building block? So I mentioned earlier, each building blocks, it has one or multiple, it has a purpose, it has multiple goals. It's like, what are the tasks that you expect it to do? It has a set of capabilities, which is actual kind of features or specific things you should be able to validate and compare between tools. Like capabilities are actually the one that matters, and we've been classifying them in which one are that are musts, which one are nice to have or should, so that it is easier to understand all of that. And then there's a set of boundaries, but they're not as defined. In this specific presentation, I only capture the goals for each of them, so we're going to go through that now. It's just we didn't have time to cover everything. But if you're interested, there's more content online. There's all of that that is available. Again, I can send you some links. So let's start with the intent. The goal of the intent is to store what is the expected state of the environment. And it will store like the config, the topology, the services, and both at the technical and at the business layer. So if you look at the goals of the intent, it needs to capture everything about the network. It needs to have this ability to capture in a vendor agnostic way what your network should look like. Again, I said both from the technical and the business layer. It has this create the trust, and like something very important usually is the ability to control the changes that will go into your network. So we have now those concepts of version control. They are very important in those systems. And it also has this function of aggregation, usually around all the different, if you have multiple systems that represent the system of records for a lot of data, there's also an aggregation function. So that's the intent. The type of data we can find from the, it's usually like all the IPAM, the routing, secrets, the circuit information, cabling information. We like to say usually like it's whatever you need to rebuild your entire network if you completely disappear tomorrow. That will include the templates, that will include all of that. And more what we're seeing is we also have customer capturing not just the technical implementation, but also the design, the higher level, the things that usually go into the Visio diagrams tends to also be captured in those systems more and more, so that you don't have to go into the low-level details of that. Then moving on to the executor, this one role is very simple. It's to push the changes to the network. It's translate your intent and deploy that into the network. So make sure that you have the right data in the right place. Make sure you have the right support for all the right APIs, the credentials, have the ability to roll back a change, like some of those fundamental things that you need to be able to deploy a change on a large and heterogeneous network. Then we have the observability and the collector block. So the way we defined it, and there was some questions on LinkedIn earlier, observability is a very generic term. In this specific case, observability is primarily about storing and processing the data. And the collector, as its name suggests, is really about picking the information from the network and storing it into the observability block. So what you would expect from the observability is you want to be able to capture all the different type of data that you have. You will be able to do the correlations, have the enrichments. You'll be able to have some query engine to actually be able to analyze and kind of do some query on your data. Manage, we mentioned the heterogeneous environments. Scale is usually a very high, like as compared to the intent, that is usually a much smaller data set. Here, the challenge is usually scale. I think during the Net Fabric presentation earlier, it was clear like the volume of events, the volume of logs, the volume of metrics, and the bigger your network is, the more challenging those systems get. So that's all the challenge we need to address specifically in the observability step. Then we have the orchestrator, which is really in the middle for a reason. It's really the one that touches all of them and that applies the workflow. In many ways, nowadays, orchestrator is kind of becoming the AI component of all of that. Should probably do a dedicated presentation on how does all of that fit into AI. That's usually questions we get. Actually, I strongly believe that in AI environments, we'll be able to do a lot more in this context if you think that this orchestrator become an agent, because it has a very structured, it has access to a very structured environments. It knows exactly how to push changes. There's a lot of guardrails. They will make those AI system even better overall. So the goal of the orchestration is to coordinate all the other building blocks, make the decisions, capture your specific workflow, and help you drive that. Also react to events and make sure we have the ability to recover, if something doesn't work as expected. All those different things. And the last one is the presentation layer. So there was actually some discussion on this one. It's like, do we even need a presentation layer? In some way, it feels like all the tools have it. And we made it for, I think a reason that's very important is that first, more and more we're seeing dedicated front end that are surfacing. Like even though every tool has its own front end, we're seeing that more and more customers are actually building dedicated system just for that. Because they don't necessarily want to expose the more like specialist interface of each tools to their end users. They want to have a nice interface that exposes that. And the other way is that I've seen a lot of people actually combining the orchestration and the presentation layer in the same tools, and then they end up like pinning themselves in a corner because they build this great workflow, but they can only run it through their CLI. And then they realize that, actually, I would like to have an API. I would like to trigger that from another tools, but they realize that they actually build that into the Slack application that they built, or whatever application they built. And by combining the presentation and orchestration is usually one of the most classical mistakes we can make. And it's actually super important to have a separate orchestrator that can expose your workflow, in a very programmatic way, and decouple that to how do you actually trigger them. And that usually is a very important sign of resilience and maturity. So again, authentications, the API, providing a way to aggregate the data from the different blocks. And also, sometimes you're going to have the same workflow, there will be different, if you're talking to the operation team, they might use that in CLI, to your end customers, they might go through a portal, but at the end, it is potentially using the same workflow internally with different approval processes and so on, depending on who used that. So that's a bit of a quick overview, but in the time that we have, we couldn't get deeper. Again, if you're interested, love to chat, love to point you at more resources on that. There's a few additional resources you can also look at. Christian, as part of the group, actually is maintaining a super rich and a really good book on network automation, completely free. It's online. So that's the address that you have here. Claudia has been working on providing a wizard to actually help you navigate, like how do you map your system into this framework. And to close as a summary, keep in mind that this is not a standard. It's not something rigid. It's really about a guide. You don't need everything to get started. We really encourage everyone to think of automation as a system. Think of the car that I was showing earlier. And before thinking about the tools that you want to use, focus on the functions that you need, and then map them to the tools. And then your life will be easier. Don't need to reinvent the wheel. We're in this field that there's so much that you're going to have to build because you cannot buy this car. So, you better, buy what you can and build what you must in some way. That was always the mantra that we're trying to follow, because we have this tendency of always trying to build, and usually we don't have enough resources to build everything we would like to build. At least that's my experience. And yeah, love, the next things we encourage everyone is, if you already have some very existing automation system, love to see how that maps into these systems. I'm sure there's things we missed. We'd love to get some feedback, the good, the bad. It's a community efforts in many ways. And if you want to help, all the discussion is happening into the Network Automation Forum community. There's a Slack channel, and there's also everything in GitHub. So thank you very much. And yeah, if you have any question, love to answer that.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Cipriano from Sunrise. Question regarding observability and representation. So is there a recommended way for how to detect and represent deviations between what's configured on the device and the modeled platform intent plus the modeled service intent? So row configuration, for instance.
Yeah, it's a very good. Usually, it's a mix of, some of it is done in the workflow. If it's about just like comparing, let's say the one that works, it's probably the easiest. Is just like if you're able to generate the full configuration and you have a backup config, then that's the easiest to just compare them and highlight the diff. The other way would be to extract structured data from each of them and compare that. But unfortunately, that's a much bigger challenge. Otherwise, using the alerting block, if you're able to like capture in some way in your observability stack the important element of your intent, and then have the alerting system resurface that, but it's more of an advanced workflow.
So basically, just compare the intent.
I think the easiest way would be try to generate the full config and try to compare that. I know it's not always possible to push the full config, but at least usually if you're able to generate them to make this comparison, your life is going to be a lot easier.
Thank you.
Any other question? No?
Thank you
I
very
would
much.
thank you very much.